Hi, I'm Dr. Daniel Binus, and I'm a holistic psychiatrist. And before we start this podcast, I'd really like to introduce you to our brand new intensive online program called Overcoming Anxiety and Depression. Check this out. We all have times where we feel depressed. We all have times where we feel anxious.
Most of us think that, if I feel a certain way, that I'm the victim. But in fact, most of us are the victim of our own thoughts.
Take a step back. If you're talking to that coworker and you're starting to feel your blood boil, you need to stop, take a step back.
So trying to get over anxiety and depression without addressing what we eat is like trying to ride a bike with your brakes stuck on.
This is an 8-week program that is going to assist you in your battle for optimal mental health. Welcome to the Beautiful Minds online intensive program. Our next program starts March 5th, 2024. To learn more, go to beautifulmindswellness.org or click on the link below. We're looking forward to seeing you there. Now to the podcast. Welcome to the Brain People Podcast, a show where 4 mental health experts team up to bring you practical tools for overcoming mental health challenges. The Brain People don't replace your doctor or therapist, but we will give you some extra tools to help you on your journey. So join us as we fight mental illness, one episode at a time.
Hello, and welcome to the Brain People Podcast. My name is Jonathan Edens, and I'll be one of the co-hosts today. We've got an exciting topic. I'm joined today by Amanda, and we will be discussing healthy versus unhealthy ways of coping with mental health issues, specifically that of anxiety and depression. Why is this an important topic for us to discuss, Amanda?
Because we don't want to get worse.
That's a good point. So let's just go ahead and jump right into it. We'll start with some healthy ways of coping, and maybe actually before we do that, maybe we should define just for those of us that are listening. I know probably just about everybody has an idea of what this term means, but can you give us kind of a definition of what it means to cope?
Well, coping, sometimes we can actually cope even before something happens. We can learn coping mechanisms or techniques and stuff. A lot of my clients will say, oh, I didn't need to use any coping techniques. But oftentimes those are preventative measures too, so we don't get worse. But coping mechanisms or coping techniques are just things that help us deal with everyday life. Yeah,
absolutely. Very, very succinct way of putting it. So the first coping mechanism that we'd like to discuss is that of physical exercise.
Yes.
So this is definitely one of the tried and true, most effective, over the long term, things that you can do to help with a variety of things, but specifically with mental health. Now, we won't dive into too much detail on this particular topic. If you want more information, we had a fairly comprehensive discussion on exercise, and that was in episode 12. So we'll refer you back to that. But there has been, just kind of in summary, sort of briefly, there's been a number of studies that have shown that exercise, particularly, moderate to
cardio exercises.
Yeah, cardiovascular exercises of moderate intensity on a regular basis can be as effective, if not more effective, than that of antidepressant medication.
Yeah, and it's cheaper.
It is cheaper and less side effects often.
Yes, fewer side effects for sure.
And so there's a number of reasons why this is the case, but once again, I'll refer our listeners back to episode 12 if you would like a list of, I believe we went through like 8 different hypotheses for why exercise is so effective. So also, generally speaking, depending on the type of exercise, another good coping strategy is that of spending time in nature.
Yeah, and you can do those at the same time.
Exactly. And I think our listeners will probably recognize that you can do a lot of these things that we're going to talk about at the same time. So if you're one that loves to be optimized, then that's definitely
you like
something
to, be
to consider.
efficient.
Yes. So why is spending time in nature an important coping skill?
Well, one of the things about nature is it tends to be very relaxing, and the sounds of nature actually tend to be more in line with the natural rate of our hearts. When we live in city environments and stuff, there's a lot of loud noises and fast-paced sounds that we hear. And unbeknownst to us, sometimes what that does is that actually increases our heart rate. So when we get in nature, when we're listening to the sound of breeze, even water rushing, birds chirping, there tends to be a slowness to the heart rate and even our breathing too, because those go hand in hand. And there's something very nice about nature.
Calming.
And it's very calming. And some people have even heard that it, increases negative ions and stuff like that. That's also very beneficial. But there's just, it's so interesting, even when I talk with my clients, how often they will say that when they go to their quote unquote happy place, if you want to call it that it's somewhere in nature. Yeah. It's somewhere where, not a lot of people are, where they're just surrounded by very natural things.
There's less stimulation, right? Oftentimes, and you're sort of broadening your scope or your attention, if you will, right? And often that in and of itself. So I'm thinking of when you are sort of have narrow vision on a phone, right? That's versus just looking out at a beautiful sunset or a mountain range or something like that, right?
Yeah, you can't click from the bird chirp to the tree, swaying to the water.
No, you can't.
You're going to take all of it in. And that's actually one of the benefits of living in the moment versus just taking a picture of it too. The picture doesn't give you the whole of it. And that's actually one of the benefits of being in nature. You get the whole experience, all the senses.
A couple things that I would add to that is, generally when you're in nature, especially if it's a nice day, right, you're going to be getting plenty of oxygen, clean, fresh oxygen, generally speaking, as well as sunlight. And both of those are also really good things for your health that we've talked about extensively in other podcasts.
Hard to get bad air in nature.
Yeah, absolutely. So the third healthy coping mechanism is that of counting your blessings or doing a gratitude journal or something along those lines. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, gratitude. When we have depression and anxiety, our minds tend to be focused on one area and one area only. I call it hyper-focusing. And we're hyper-focusing on the negative versus there are positive things happening, there are neutral things happening, but we're tending towards the negative things. And what that does is it atrophies the brain even to look for positive things anymore. So the more narrow we get on focusing on the negative things, the less we're able to even see the positive. So training the brain to notice the good things that are happening or the things that you're thankful for or grateful for actually helps you expand your brain and not be so narrow focused.
Yeah, absolutely. For those that have listened to some of our cognitive behavioral therapy episodes, she's primarily talking about the distortions of disqualifying the positive and tunnel vision, right? And so
and mental filtering too.
And mental filtering. We can reverse those types of natural distortions by being consistent with these types of practices. So any particular sort of tips or techniques for people that want to build gratitude, want to create more gratitude in their lives?
Yeah, one of the things that I've noticed with some of my clients who've been in a very long, persistent state of depression, especially, is that it's hard for them to, quote unquote, feel grateful. So they have a hard time even saying what they're grateful for. So what I like to encourage them to do is think about something you would miss if you didn't have it. Oh, I'd miss hot showers. Oh, therefore I must be grateful for that. So then that's when you can say, oh, I must be grateful for that. And that even helps change the brain. But another thing too is we can take it a step deeper. It's easy to be grateful for things that, a roof over my head, my family, my friends kind of thing. Those are kind of automatic things. So it's helpful to stretch yourself a bit. Force yourself to notice things like, I'm looking across the room, I'm like, I'm grateful for batteries. You know how many things operate off of batteries? If we didn't have them, what we would have to do. I'm grateful for toast or bread or something like that. Those are the not so obvious things, but it takes me a little bit to stretch my mind to open itself up to even more things than just kind of the rote answers that we get or we parrot from what other people say. And then if you want to take it even a step further, I call this advanced gratitude, even finding good in difficult things. So it's not disqualifying the positive, it's actually disqualifying the negative. I'm looking for things, or positive filtering. I'm looking for even good things like, yeah, this work project is going to take me all day, but look how it's going to make me razor sharp for when I have to present on this topic, and I'm going to know so much about it now.
Sure. It's a great way to redeem struggles, trials, and lives.
That's a good way of saying it, redeeming struggles.
And that's often, at least my sort of default when you're going through a tough time, is to focus on what you can learn from that experience, right? How it can refine you and make you a better person. So
I think we've even talked about that in a podcast, like grit, you know?
Definitely. That was in our one of our earlier ones. So another coping technique would be to practice grounding, mindfulness, or prayer. So can you elaborate on this as well?
Yeah, a lot of us spend so much time being very busy that we forget that it's okay to just slow down and even think, you know, just process stuff that's going on. So a lot of people think mindfulness is, you know, I have to not focus on anything, or I have to like completely, or even meditation, that I have to like completely eliminate all thoughts. But sometimes even this kind of overlaps with some things. Our listeners are going to notice we kind of overlap. Some things work in other categories as well.
Sure.
But even being focused on what's just right here in the present. I just want to focus here. If I'm anxious, I'm probably thinking about the future. If I'm depressed, I'm probably thinking about the past. But just being mindful of what's happening in the here and now. I just want to do that. And some people, you'll notice they'll even like rub their arm or something I'm doing that while you're listening, rub their arm to just get in the present. And one of the ways that you can even do that more specifically or another technique for that is the 5-4-3-2-1 method. It's a form of grounding where you look for 5 things that you can see and call them out. You know, you could tell somebody else or just take a catalog in your mind. 4 things that you can touch and literally touch those things. You know, I'm touching the pillow, the wood on my chair here, and go through 4 things that you can touch. 3 things that you can hear. I can hear the sound of some machine working in the background right now. I can hear the sound of your voice. I can hear maybe the air conditioning or something going at the same time. 2 things that you can smell. Yes, thank you. I almost forgot where I was. And these things, like, sometimes you don't really smell anything, but sometimes you can even take things that you know the smell of very, very well. Like I'm thinking of lavender right now. I can smell that almost right now, just thinking about the smell. So even taking that in. And then the last thing, one thing you can taste. And it doesn't have to be something in your mouth. If you're chewing a piece of gum, that's going to be an easy one, or eating food, that's going to be easy. But even just remembering a taste, like what does salty air taste like when you're at the beach or something like that? Just taking that into mind. And the big thing about this is that when we're doing these things, we're not focusing on the feelings. And I'm not talking about the emotions so much, but I'm not focused so much on the tension in my body, or I'm not focused so much on, you know, my stomach churning or a stomach ache or a headache forming because of my anxiety. I'm focusing on just what is happening around me. Too often we focus on what's going on inside our heads, or, you know, what I'm feeling physically, and it consumes us. We hyper focus on those things. But just to go outside of that, it helps ground us to, okay, I'm in the moment. Maybe nothing really bad is happening, even though it feels like things are happening inside of me. And I find a lot of my clients actually get a big benefit from that.
Yeah. So in kind of summary, in my mind, this process of grounding, of mindfulness, of prayer, a lot of it is redirecting our attention to something that is as you said, maybe external, even if it is internal, it's not a negative experience, right? It's something that's either positive, so you could even focus on what you're grateful for, right? Or it's something that's neutral.
Positive psychology, the mindfulness is mindfulness on gratitude, things that you're grateful for. And it actually has, there's a secondary effect of this too. It can actually reduce pain for chronic pain, healers or people who go through chronic pain. That's actually a part of, pain management programs. They'll use that positive, psychology stuff. And I do want to say a little thing about prayer is recognizing that I don't have to solve all my problems, so those people who are, prayers and see that as something that they're willing to do or, open to doing, it's really nice. It's like having a big parent that, I don't have to take care of this. My big daddy or my big mama is going to take care of it. And they know what to do even when I don't have.
You're sort of unloading the burden of all that pressure, right? And I think for those that deal with chronic worry, generalized anxiety, those are often, the people that, in my experience, when they have sort of this, prayer life, this spiritual walk, that they find a lot of healing in that, right?
And there's a lot of good research too that shows that it does actually help people. So
so our next coping strategy would be to find a positive sort of social network. So can you talk a little bit about that too?
Yeah, especially people who have been hurt. Sometimes that's really hard to do, but there is some good in connection, like some real good stuff in connection. There's some great books if you want to read about, the benefits of connection. There's a book called Friendimacy. There's a book called Beyond Boundaries or Safe People by the same author and stuff. And it shows just how being connected to other people is really beneficial to us. We often, if you've ever watched the movie with Tom Hanks, I think, Castaway.
Oh, yeah.
What happened to him when he was isolated on an island for so long?
He kind of went crazy.
Yeah, and that's what happens to us too when we isolate too long. Those thoughts in our head that we're telling ourselves, those certain things, there's nothing to check those. And that's why even therapy is so beneficial because when I share things that are on my mind, even without my therapist saying something, as it's coming out of my mouth, there's an awareness of, oh, there's another human being that's going to hear this. And how does that sound to them? It's an added filter even.
Sure.
But if it stays in my head, I don't ever have to use that filter.
Yeah.
And I can just reassure myself, oh, yeah, that's accurate. That's totally normal. That's fine. But then there's also the added benefit of even the oxytocin that comes from social support, from hugs, from, just somebody taking your hand while you're going through a difficult moment or something like that. And so there's so many aspects of social support that is really good for us. And unfortunately, during COVID, a lot of people didn't get to benefit from that. But it's amazing what people do when they got back to get connected with people. As scared as they might have been, a lot of good came out of that. They realized, I really missed this. I didn't have this all along.
Yeah, one of the quotes I often say is that you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with, and so really a lot of the techniques that we're talking about today could technically be either good or bad, right?
Absolutely.
And so if your social network is not if these are people that are not necessarily living the type of lifestyle or have similar type of goals that you do, then to a certain extent, it could be a negative coping skill. Right?
Absolutely. So that's why I recommended the books too, because those books help you recognize not just healthy traits in other people, but also the kind of traits you want to have in order to be a healthy person in that social circle that you find.
Sure. So the next one we're going to talk about a little bit is using deep breathing or progressive muscle relaxation. So can you just talk a little bit about a couple breathing techniques that you've used with your clients, and then I'll talk a little bit about the progressive muscle relaxation.
Sure. So there's like the box method of, breathing in for 4, holding for 4, and breathing out for 4. And I like to encourage people, this isn't a fast 4. This is a slow 4. We want to breathe in slowly because remember, we want to slow the heart rate down. We don't want to speed it up.
Yep.
And so when you do the box breathing, that can be extremely helpful for 1, slowing down the breathing, and 2, helping you, get your heart rate down so you can think more clearly as well. So hold the breath. And we have 2 different kinds of breathing besides box breathing. There's also the belly breathing too. I like to call it balloon breathing, where most people, when we breathe in, we go and our stomach pulls in. But I want you to think of your stomach as like a balloon. If you breathe in, your belly should actually go out or extend with the air coming in. And likewise, as you breathe out, your belly should pull in, or the balloon should, deflate as the air goes out. And it's just a little helpful thing to, 1, to engage the diaphragm, but 2, to actually help you think about your breathing, because we don't often do it that way.
Sure. And one way to do that, some people do find helpful, you can lay on your back, and you can put your hand on your chest and on your stomach, and the hand on the chest should not really move all that much, right? Yeah. But the hand on the stomach should move quite a bit. This was something that I had to learn because I used to play trumpet actually in high school. And when you're in a marching band, you cannot, especially because the trumpet, the mouthpiece is, if you're moving up and down a lot, it makes it really hard to play. Yeah. So you have to get really good at expanding your diaphragm.
Same with singing.
So these techniques are not just good for relaxation, but also good for just the
Across
natural
the board.
rhythm. Yep.
Yeah.
So
tell us about deep muscle relaxation, because this is one of my favorites.
Yeah, so progressive muscle relaxation, I tend to recommend it a lot, not just for those with anxiety, but specifically where that anxiety is leading to a lot of like physical tension. It's another way of kind of redirecting some of the focus. A lot of people also find it quite helpful prior to bedtime, right?
Yes.
And so the way you go about progressive muscle relaxation is you find a quiet place. Oftentimes you're going to do it laying down, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. You can do it. You can do it sitting down, but generally standing isn't going to be the best idea for this.
At least leaning back.
At least leaning back, yes. And so you will essentially start typically from your toes and work up the major muscle groups. And what you'll be doing is you'll be intentionally sort of squeezing that particular muscle group, and then you'll relax it. Yeah. And then you kind of move up, right? So you start in your toes, you go to your calves, you go to your quads, you go to your abs, right? You go to your glutes, right? You go to your chest, and so on and so forth as you work your way up. And so the process of squeezing and relaxing has of these different muscle groups definitely can have some relaxation effects, but also, like we were talking about previously with this mindfulness, the redirecting of the attention, learning to feel the tension, and then learning to release the tension over and over. So if you tend to carry a lot of tension as a result of your anxiety, definitely a good practice.
And some of us aren't even aware of where we carry our tension, and it's a good way to recognize where you carry your tension. I know for me, my glutes, sometimes when I'm driving, I get all intense and stuff. I'm like, wow, I'm tight there. And I realize, okay, relax.
Yeah.
But you won't know that necessarily until you feel that tension there. And it's just a way of being mindful of where it is.
The most common sort of area that I typically hear about, I'd say, is the neck and the shoulders, right? A lot of people, and I think part of that is overuse of technology, right? But clearly it is, or poor posture, like I'm exhibiting right now. But clearly it's this technique is often useful for a variety of different conditions. So spending just a few minutes prior to bed or first thing when you wake up, or maybe in the middle of the day if you're dealing with something kind of stressful and you can't quite remember the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 rule, right? This is one that's sort of easy to spend a minute or two and work your way through.
And breathe while you're doing it.
Yep, definitely breathe while you're doing it.
You can get 2 things out of it.
So the next positive, sort of healthy coping skill is creative outlets.
Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit about that, Amanda.
Well, we just made a little list of things, and anything that is hands-on, like you said, we live in a world kind of centered around technology, and we we get kind of 2-dimensional focused instead of being 3-dimensional focused. And even the smallest act of like, coloring a picture and finishing it, you get a little dopamine hit from doing that.
Yeah.
And so if you're painting, it doesn't even have to just be what we would consider creative, but maybe it's like fixing, changing a light bulb or something like that. Just that hands-on, like I'm doing something, gives you that little dopamine hit so that the next thing isn't so hard to do, and then the next thing isn't so hard to do. But definitely creative stuff like drawing. You could do a puzzle. I know for some people that would drive them crazy. So these are obviously find the ones that you tend to like. I tend to like puzzles. But coloring, painting, drawing, puzzles, all kinds of things, even playing a game with a little kid, where you move the stuff around the board and that sort of thing. Cooking could even be a creative outlet, putting stuff together, the ingredients in just the right way and measuring it. All of those can be really helpful.
So I would also add consuming certain types of creative content. So, things like music or maybe plays or poems or books. Like these things can also be, a healthy sort of outlet as well. I've got a patient right now that's been one of his, writing poetry and then listening to sort of classical music or, music from kind of a few decades ago that he hasn't really explored in a while.
Yeah.
He's just, rather than coming home and watching TV, he's been turning on his, I guess probably his computer or his phone, just playing music and just sitting there and listening to the beat and trying to be mindful, I guess, of all the different intricacies of the creative process of writing. And so that has been very therapeutic for him.
Yeah, and even listening to music and listening, like you said, for the different instruments or looking for a theme, because a lot of old classical pieces will have different, movements within them. And so you'll see a more upbeat movement or a more somber movement. And so just following that along and even contemplating what is the story behind this too. And that's really active listening to the music.
So the next one, and we kind of already briefly mentioned this, but reading a book or listening to a podcast, which you all are doing a great job at this point.
And good podcasts too, like this one.
So there are some reasons, and we'll just go through them very quickly. And I realize that some of these may seem a little bit far-fetched, but surprisingly, there's actually some research to back up these claims. But reading books, listening to podcasts, other forms of sort of healthy resources to engage with that can improve your comprehension and knowledge, right? They can help you live longer. They can improve cognitive functioning. They can increase empathy, help with your self-identity, and of course, sort of increase your knowledge base and increase your vocabulary. So all very good things.
Yeah, and even learning something new is a great counter to even like addiction issues and stuff like that, which we'll get to later.
Which we will. And then the last healthy coping skill we'd like to talk about is positive reframing.
Yeah.
So you're the therapist. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, most of us don't realize, and we do have a podcast on this one, I'm not sure which number it is, but most of us don't realize that every thought that we think is not necessarily accurate. And so we want to be mindful of the thoughts that may not be accurate, may be holding us back in life, and be willing to change those things if they're not. And I just recommend looking for something, listen to our podcast, by the way, but look for the truth and look for the helpfulness of a belief versus just believing something because I had it cross my mind. And that will definitely help you. Be willing to let go of your ego. A lot of us have a lot of ego connected to our beliefs, and we don't realize that ego is holding us back. And so be willing to challenge and admit, like, hey, maybe this belief hasn't been helping me, and I don't want to hold on to this one anymore.
Absolutely. So we'll shift gears and we'll talk about some unhealthy ways of coping. So some of these are going to be a little bit more obvious than others.
Yeah.
And so let's go ahead and jump right into the first one. So this would be reckless and addictive type of behaviors. So what are some specific behaviors that would fall into this category?
Yeah. And again, these are going to overlap too with some of the other categories, but drugs and alcohol, that's an obvious one if we talk about substance substance abuse and that sort of thing. That's the one that people always think of. But the ones we don't think of sometimes are even caffeine. If I have anxiety, caffeine may not be the best thing for me.
Sure.
And even a little bit of alcohol, if I have medications or something like that, is not the best thing for me to mix with those medications. But even food can be a substance abuse too. That'll also come in a different category. But sometimes we're not eating because we're actually hungry or we need fuel to get our body going. We're eating for comfort. That's why we call it comfort food, and that is an unhealthy coping mechanism because that'll get us to a place maybe where the food is not helping us anymore with fuel. It's actually hurting us. It can be increased weight gain. It can be, just unhealthy foods too, like fats and sweets that aren't necessarily good for our bodies health-wise. And we know that our physical health affects our mental health.
Another activity or unhealthy coping skill could be that of unsafe sexual encounters.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people when they're feeling depressed, right, or they're feeling anxious, they may seek out a sort of sexual experience that is
mm-hmm.
generally regarded as unsafe for them, both physically but also often emotionally.
Yeah, and that's even something that, if you go to AA or NA, they'll even tell you, you don't want the drugs, the alcohol, but while you're in this program, don't hook up with other people in the program because they realize you can use sex to get the same kind of high that you would get from the drugs too,
Sure.
without understanding the person you're connecting with that way.
And then overspending. So,
Mm-hmm.
I know retail therapy, as people describe it, right? That can be a little bit dangerous, not only for your pocketbook, but can be a habit that can, ultimately lead to some pretty significant consequences.
And I've seen a lot of couples and families also be hurt by one person's overspending and that sort of thing. So when you go into Target, be careful.
Have a budget, all right?
Yes.
And
go in with a list and stick to it.
Yeah, we're not trying to be black and white here and saying that you enjoying spending the money that you've worked hard for on things that bring you value in life is not a good thing, right?
Yeah.
But the impulsive shopping, not having control over that, not having guardrails and boundaries around how much you're spending, that is something that could get you into a lot of trouble.
And if you have a problem with that, take it back. You don't have to keep it just because you bought it. Go back and return it.
Absolutely. So this next category could really kind of encompass everything, but we did want to separate it out from some of the reckless and addictive behaviors. But that's a category of avoidance.
Yes.
So tell us, why is avoidance an unhealthy way of coping, and then what sort of things might fall under being a pattern of avoidance?
I think I've mentioned this in another podcast, but I like to call it doing our emotional laundry. And some of us have not been doing our emotional laundry. We're letting things build up and build up and build up, only to reap the consequences of it, when in fact what we're doing is trying to avoid it, which makes the problem even bigger over time and can even add other things. So it's important to face the stuff that we have difficulties with or we're struggling with. And some of us have learned that. It's not that we want to avoid, we've just, maybe other people, our parents have taught us how to avoid and not face it, and avoidance could be food even, and it could be sleep and that sort of thing, instead of facing the problem and being willing to work on it. That's why some people still haven't come to therapy, maybe, because I don't want to accept that this is a problem. And this is also where some people use dissociation. So avoidance can also be a form of dissociation. And one of the most basic ones we do is as soon as we don't have anything to do right in front of us, we get on our phone. We start reading something and that turns into 3 hours later. Whoa, where'd the time go?
Yeah, I would say that at least one of the most obvious ones in our current culture is that of technology, and excessive sort of phone use, video game use, entertainment, social media, news, all of these things. If you're not having guardrails sort of around your consumption of that stuff, it can definitely start to take over your life. And I think it's pretty clear to a lot of us that these very powerful computers in our pockets that go with us, virtually 24/7, do not always have the best, or do not often have our best interest in mind.
Yeah, and then we don't have, because anytime we take on these things, whether it's a video game, social media, we are actually living vicariously through that show or whatever the case might be, which means I'm going through the stresses, I'm going through the lows of that experience. Even if it's not my own personal experience, I'm actually living vicariously through that thing, which means then I don't have the energy afterwards to deal with my stuff. And so I keep avoiding, because it's easier not to have to deal with my stuff, just go through somebody else's stuff that they resolve or whatever in the span of 20 to 40 minutes to an hour and a half. But I've still gone through all of the emotion and the energy and all of that stuff, only to now, how do I deal with my own stuff? Because I'm exhausted.
Yeah. I mean, to a certain extent, one could say that, the use of these things is essentially a mind-numbing agent, right?
Yeah.
We're just trying to ignore the reality that we have to deal with. And as you said, instead of facing that reality, just ignoring it, it just builds up, builds up, builds up. You're kicking that can further down the road, and that can gets bigger sort of over time, right? Another one would be, as we kind of already addressed, but we'll just briefly mention social isolation. I think as a response to COVID, this has become much easier to do for most people. And, as the world has started, opening back up over the last year or so, it's been, I think, hard for a lot of people to resume a lot of the social activities that they were doing before.
And we're out of practice too. We haven't had a lot of social conflicts, and I don't mean yelling at somebody or fighting, but just navigating through natural differences of opinion or that sort of thing, because we're out of practice. We've, maybe 2-3 years we've been out of practice. Even I've talked to teachers who say, their kids are 2 years behind socially when they came back to school, because we've been out of the habit of interaction. And that interaction takes work, and that's why we don't want to do it. It's like, I can save myself the heartache or the headache of dealing with people. But on the opposite side is I'm also saving myself from all of the benefits of connection with people, the oxytocin, the work that, dopamine that I get from doing the work when I have that hard conversation and it works out in the end.
Sure. And so we talked a little bit about eating, you mentioned, and then, but also, I think you briefly mentioned this as well, sleep. So that's a common one with people that are dealing with depression specifically, where they will use sleep as a means of just avoiding the day, essentially. Because I've had many people tell me, like, that's the only place where I feel normal, because I don't have to think or feel, right?
Yeah, I had somebody just today tell me, I can't wait to get home because I just want to go to sleep so I don't have to deal with anything anymore. And I've actually I've actually suggested to people, and I know this is I have to be careful the way that I say this, but it's an alternative sometimes to suicide.
Sure.
And I say that not because I want people to do suicide or sleep, but some of us, I'm too scared, I don't want to hurt myself and something bad happen, or I know so-and-so would be sad if I wasn't around, but I'm just going to sleep instead. I'm not really living when I'm sleeping. I'm
sleep
not,
your life away.
Yeah, you sleep your life away. You get up, you eat, you go to the bathroom, and then you go back to sleep so you don't have to deal with life. But there are beautiful things that come out of dealing with things and then getting the muscles from doing it. It's an exercise, a daily exercise that as we engage in life, we get the muscles that come with it too.
And speaking of exercise, I know you weren't necessarily talking about physical exercise right there, but that can definitely, even though we mentioned that as a positive thing, many people, and this is probably less often, but I've definitely had my share of patients where they were sort of excessively exercising to a point where it was creating damage to their bodies. And so, like with everything, there is a balance to all of this.
Yeah.
The next sort of unhealthy way of coping would be that of self-blame or deprecation. You want to touch on that?
Yeah, that's what often happens when we've already experienced, maybe emotional abuse in our life, or even physical or sexual abuse in our lives. And so it's almost like we take on that weapon that was used against us, and we keep feeling like we keep thinking that we have to beat ourselves up with it because that's all I deserve. And it goes along with the reframing or our thoughts part, but it's an actual behavior in the mind that we do. It's a constant beating. You can beat somebody up physically, but emotionally, sometimes you don't see those wounds the same way, but it's actually hurting the person even more. And we do this sometimes to ourselves. And so we don't want to beat ourselves up. None of us is worthy of being beaten by our own words, much less anyone else's too. But we want to recognize that that is actually an unsafe way of coping with things.
And then the last one we'll briefly discuss is that of self-harm.
Mm-hmm.
And so, many people, I think when they hear the word self-harm, they're thinking of cutting, but it encompasses a lot more than that, doesn't it,
Yeah,
Amanda?
I just heard somebody yesterday tell me that they burned themselves,
It's really sad.
repeatedly burning. It can, self-harm can include food, it can include self-deprecation, it can include all kinds of things. We don't want to just focus on the physical stuff, but there is a very real presence of people who do use self-harm behaviors in a physical way. It can include bruising and hitting. I've had people who've used actual weapons against themselves, their heads, their bodies. I've known people to, run themselves into a wall or, those sorts of things. Anything that hurts me that, we would say, no, that person can't do that to that person. But if I'm doing it to myself, it's no better.
Right. So we, with all of that being said, let's just go ahead and we'll wrap up and kind of summarize. And we hope that, while we know that a lot of the coping strategies that we talked about, whether healthy or unhealthy, that some of them you're probably aware of, and some of them maybe not so. So we hope that we enlighten some of you guys to think about, okay, how am I? Is this thing that I'm doing, on a regular basis, is this actually helping me in the long term? And maybe if need be, working with a life coach or a therapist, or just a mental health professional in general, on how you can learn to identify and treat some of these unhealthy coping strategies.
Yeah, I think when we talk about these things, it's kind of similar to things I want versus I need. Those two words are not the same thing. Just like what helps me short term and long term versus what hurts me short term or long term. And so just because I like something or, I love my media or whatever, doesn't mean it's actually helping me. So what actually helps me long term is important to recognize.
That's a really good way of framing it, because I think most people, as when we talk about those unhealthy ways of coping, they do it because it's what feels right in the moment.
It makes me feel good
right?
now, but not long term. How would this make me feel long term if I was to continue doing it? Thanks for listening. To hear more episodes, find us on social media, or support us financially, visit thebrainpeoplepodcast.com.